Welcome back to the shop, everybody. This week's video takes place in 2026, week 14, March 30th through April 5th, and we are continuing to build the engine. So I am just continuing where I left off, filing rings. The ring filer is having a bit of trouble with it, but once it cools down, it goes back to working. So I'm very easily able to finish off these last 3 rings. installing those last rings down didn't take too long, so we are just going to go ahead and we're going to jump into some cleanup here. The next thing that we are going to do is we are going to check our deck clearance. So what that means is I want to know how far in the hole the top of the piston is, or does it protrude from the surface of the deck? So that gives you information for a few things. So there's what's called the quench. So the quench is the distance between the top of the piston and the head surface. So that's gonna, help you decide what kind of pistons you can run. The quench is the top of the piston plus your head gasket is your quench, and that tells you how far the top of the piston is from effectively the bottom of the head. So why do you need to know this? Well, if you're running a domed piston, for example, it's going to potentially protrude out the top of the block. If that happens, you don't want the piston to contact the head. So what you may need to do is get a thicker head gasket to increase the quench so that you have space between the piston and the head. If your piston ever touched the head, that would be like the ultimate bad thing, because you're going to bend rods and do things you don't want to do. So the process, so what I'm doing right now is I torqued all the rods up previously to check their bearing clearances, I believe. So I'm just breaking all of the rods free. They don't need to be torqued up. I will end up putting them all on the block at some point, so I might as well just unbreak or break all the rods free now, or all the bolts free on the rods. So what I'm going to start with is I just want to measure the I'm not putting rings on the pistons yet, just to check the clearance. I don't need that. I can be pretty careful and not use rings. I'll oil up the outside of the piston and the bore pretty good, so it'll still slide even without rings. But what I'll do is I'm going to start by putting the pistons in the four corners and see what I get. And once I get the pistons in the four corners, if I'm not happy with the results, I'll put the rest of the pistons in and just get a measurement for all 8. So what I'm doing here is I'm ensuring that I have assembly lube on the bearing surfaces, and then I'm using that CMD number 3 under the bolt heads to make sure I get the proper torque when I torque these in, because the rods do have to be torqued to spec in order to fully check your deck clearance, because if they're not fully torqued, I mean, you could grow 2000s and then it would be, you know, growing out of the hole 2000, even though it's really not. That's all because you didn't torque it up. So now that I have those two pistons in, what I'm going to do is I'm going to zero out that deck gauge on the block, and then I will run the piston up and just see where it is. So if the piston came up to 0, that means it's zeroed. But if we are in the hole, which means it's less than 0, you know, we're in the hole and less than 0. If we're protruding, it's going to be a plus number. So we don't want to be a plus number, we want to be a minus number. The machine shop told me that they were going to spec deck this to 5 thou in the hole, and my measurements determined that was a lie. The first cylinder I checked on, that's going to be the driver's side, so that's cylinder 5, is like 7 thou in the hole. Now, don't get me wrong, it's better to be more in the hole than less. I would rather have a little bit more clearance that way, because I can get a thinner head gasket, and that leaves room for decking the surface in the future. But it's kind of frustrating that the machine shop verbally told me several times that, oh yeah, 5 thou in the hole, That's our kind of go-to, especially since the passenger side or cylinder 1 was like 10 thou. So it's not even the same side to side. Like I'd be okay, well, it's 7 thou, you know, a couple thou more in the hole, that's fine. Maybe, you know, it's a little bit hotter in their shop or a little bit colder, maybe the metal, whatever. I could go with that, but it's not even the same side to side. And to me, that's just frustrating. That just shows a lack of care in their work. And, you know, earlier I found they hadn't even pulled out the second half of my bearing shell. So there's just a lot of things where I'm like, I'm glad I'm checking this. Because I'm pretty sure the machine shop did like the bare minimum on the decking and the honing, and that was it. They didn't really check anything else. So it's just one of those things where I'm glad I'm going through this myself. But yeah, so I'm going to drop in the other two corners, measure them out. On the driver's side, cylinder number 8, I think is like 10 thou. So it's like angled from the front to the back, you know, 2 thou. On the passenger side, it ended up being, I think, like 10 thou more or less across the board. So it's weird that one side was angled and the other one wasn't. You know, do I think that 2 thou is really going to create any problems down the line? I don't think so. This is probably fine. Again, it's just frustrating and kind of shows a lack of quality and care. So would I go to that machine shop again? Probably not. But the shitty thing is they're like the closest machine shop. I think the only other machine shop is, you know, like an hour and a half away. So, you know, it was a convenience thing, but I think I'm paying the ultimate price. I'm just happy I'm checking everything myself. Well, at least as much as I know to check. So at this point in time, I've decided I don't want to just check the 4 corners. I want to check all 8 pistons just to get measurements. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to put the other 4 pistons in. I'm going to remeasure everything, make sure that, I've done everything the same for each hole. That way my measurement is the same. I've used the same method, so the measurement is done the same way. That way my results are accurate across all the holes. And I ended up being like on cylinder number 5's like 7th thou, and then 8.5 on 6, and then 8.5, and then 9 on 8 or something like that. And 1, 2, 3, 4 were like 8, 8.5, 8.5, 9.5, something like that. So not quite the 5 that I was told by the machine shop, and the fact that they're tapered kind of bothers me, but it is what it is. The engine will run just fine. This isn't a absolute maximum effort deal, so those little things not gonna affect me all that much. And again, it's better to have the piston a little bit more in the hole than less, or even like sticking out of the block. So I'm happy where it is, not happy with how the machine shop presented the work. All right, so now with all the pistons out of the block, I figured, you know what, since the head spacing or the deck clearance wasn't exactly what I was told, I should set up my micrometer for 4.125, which is what my bore is supposed to be, and I will use my inside dial bore gauge, and I will measure all of the bores just to see if they're under or oversized. So at this point in time, I am very happy with how all of these bores are turning out. They're all a little bit over. I think one was a little bit under, but I mean, we're talking within 1/1000ths of the 4/125. So super happy with the bore machine work. That was like spot on, perfect. Could not be better. I wish that the decking was as good as the boring, but here we are. With all of that work done, we are going to move on to pulling the crankshaft and the camshaft out of this engine. Now, you might be thinking, but Ben, you already torqued the mains. You put marker on all the mains indicating that they've been torqued. Yes, I have. And now, in order to continue what I'm doing, I need to pull them off. Technically speaking, I didn't need to pull it out. I could have left it in. So the reason why I'm pulling this all out is I'm going to paint the block. The block just being rough iron, it's not horrible, but I want it to be, after I've gone through all the work of painting the car and the diff and everything else, I want the block to look pretty good. So I'm going to paint it. Now, technically, since the crank is in machine surfaces, I'm not painting any of that anyways. Yeah, I technically could have left the crank in. I could have left the cam in, but my theory and thought process was if I end up missing the masking in any way and any paint gets on the cam or the crank, I'm going to be very upset with myself. If it's on the machine surfaces, yeah, I can kind of just clean it off. But if I get it, anywhere else, technically, yeah, I could just clean it off, but, I don't want to run that risk. For me, it's just better, take it out, clean everything, tape everything up with all that stuff out, and then, reduce the risk of even getting paint on it. So that's why I took it out. Now that we have everything cleaned, it is time to start taping off the block. My initial thought was I was going to, put some tape on the outside of like the crank surface here where the oil pan would go. And what I would do is just take a little bit of plastic in the middle. But I eventually just ended up using tape for everything. It was probably quicker, less hassle. It just worked. So that's what I did. So I'm putting tape on everything, and then I'll take a razor blade and fine tune all the taping. I want to tape the block or the freeze plugs off. I don't want those red. Oh shit, I guess I gave away the color. Yeah, I'm painting the block red. If you're on my Instagram, you would have already seen this. But yeah, I figure mask off all the things, freeze plugs. I've got bolts in all the holes. I'm going to tape off like where the oil filter is going to go, the timing cover. All the machine surfaces get taped off. So yeah, just use a lot of tape and then a razor blade to cut it and fine tune it. And that's all we need to do. With the block all taped off, it's time to prep the shop. So I'm going to put some tape over my bench. I don't want to get any overspray on the stuff. So I'm going to put plastic over the bench. I'll put plastic over my car as well, because I really don't want to get plastic all over that. And then I will also put some plastic over my toolbox, because I'm going to be painting in the front corner by the garage door. That way I can open the door crack, get some fans going, and kind of suck all the fumes out as best I can. But yeah, so just, masking off and protecting things best I can. So I just kind of prepped the block with some wax and degreaser, and now I'm working on getting my spray booth set up. So I'm just using that little cardboard box. It's got all my gaskets in it. And I'm just going to use that to, you know, mix paint, clean the gun, everything like that, because my bench is full of engine parts right now. So this is the same process that I did when I painted the rest of the car, so I'm not going to talk too much about it. But what I'm going to do is lay down 2 coats of epoxy primer, reduced 20%, so it's a sealer. Hopefully that'll keep everything stuck to the block. In this case, I'm going to do 3 coats of red, just because I had extra red, so I was like, screw it, I'll put a little bit extra on instead of wasting it. And then I will do, I think I do like 1 light coat of clear and then 2 heavier coats of clear. And then this block will be beautifully painted. I am very happy with the color choice and everything else. And of course, between each of the colors, I will clean the gun. I am so happy with how this block came out. It looks so good. Again, videos and pictures just do not do it justice. It is just absolutely gorgeous. So here I am. The clear has been curing about 20 to 30 minutes already, so I'm just taking all the masking off. If it were to fully dry and I left the masking on, it's possible that it would kind of chip some of the clear. So while it's still a little bit wet and just starting to cure, you can pull it off, and I think it's better to do it that way. Again, I'm not a painter, so I don't know, but fortunately I protected all of the machine surfaces. I didn't get any paint or anything where I didn't want it to. And yeah, this block, it just looks so freaking good. It is going to look so good in that engine bay. right, so now that the block is dry, I think I let it cure for a day, so we're like a day later. It's time to start putting the crank back in, put the camshaft back in, and then we'll start getting some pistons in this engine. I went through this process recently, but it's, I'm cleaning out all of the bearing surfaces, and then I'm going to put the block side bearing caps in, put assembly lube all over the crank, make sure I get assembly lube on the inside of the rear main seal, that way I don't burn up the seal. Drop the crankshaft in, clean up all the bearing caps, make sure that all the bearing caps are dry, there's nothing behind the bearings, put the bearings in, assembly lube on there, and then put some more of the CDP number 3 under and on all of the bolts before I torque the crank into the block. Then I'll put the camshaft in, same way I did it before. Lube up all of the cam lobes. Actually, no, I'm going to do the camshaft first. That way I can lube up the camshaft as I'm putting it in, and then before final install, put a little bit more assembly lube on all of the journals. So yeah, camshaft first, and then I'll do what I said with the crank. But yeah, just cleaning it off now because I did have a bunch of assembly lube on it. It's been sitting on the bench, so why not give it one good cleaning before reassembly, right? So before I fully torque down the crank, I'm like, I'm going to take a look at my oil pump and make sure that it all fits. So I get the oil pump on there. I start, I'm just looking at it and I'm like, that, the crankshaft just smashes directly into it. Like, this is not good. This is not just a little clearancing that it needs. It is completely and totally hooped. The counterweight is yeah, like just fully smashing it. If I tried to put that in, it would have broken. And then I realized, oh, I have the oil pump in the wrong way. I had it on the wrong way. So with it installed the right way, there's a tiny little bit of clearance, but I do need to clearance it a little bit more. So I'm going to take a little bit of a marker or a paint pen. Well, I'm going to install the studs first, get the oil pump loosely installed, take my paint pen, and just kind of mark where I need to do a little bit of clearancing. That way I can take the oil pump off the engine, do just a tiny little bit of clearancing with a carbide burr, and then I'll have plenty of clearance. Like right now, I've gotten 10 to 15 thou clearance if I had to hazard a guess. I didn't actually measure it, but it wasn't a lot, and I wasn't too happy with how little it was. So I've marked the oil pump. I'm not going to clearance it just yet. I'll do that when I actually go to install it. Alrighty, with the crank installed, I'm just going to do a little bit of cleanup. The bench was getting pretty messy, and I was starting to feel a little like claustrophobic, like just couldn't find anything, and everything was just messy, and I didn't like it, so clean up. All right, so now it is time to install piston rings on the pistons. As with everything, there is a process for this. What I'm doing right now is just cleaning off all of the bearings, the rods, just getting them ready for reinstall. But yeah, so there's all of the rings need to be clocked a specific way. The top ring has a chamfer that goes to the top. The bottom ring says top on it, that goes to the top. The oil rings and scrapers get installed a specific way. Everything has its very specific way of being installed. When I eventually get to my engine build series, it'll be included in all of that.
is a special piston ring installation tool that I do not have. Luckily, I do have some internal O-ring pliers, external. Oh, what are those? Not O-rings. External C-clips. Yeah, maybe they're C-clips. I don't know. Anyways, I do have a tool that will work. And it's one of those things where as I'm going through this, I'm getting better at it. So the first thing I need to install is, because this is a 363, the piston wrist pin goes through the oil scraper groove or ringland. So they send you with these support rails that are a little bit thicker, so that when you put the actual oil scrapers in there, you know, they don't sink into where the oil piston would go, because they're pretty thin. Like the actual oil scraper and the oil groove rings, they're pretty thin. So they would, you know, very good chance they would bend and deflect and, you know, potentially spin out of the like as the ring spins, it could potentially unravel itself. You get caught on the wrist pin ledge and then spin out. So that's what that support groove is for. Now, when I was trying to do this the first time, I did this wrong. I put in the bottom oil scraper ring, but I'm supposed to put the actual oil scraper itself in and then do the top and bottom rings. So fortunately, Mercury Motorsport bailed me out on a weekend. I was able to message him, and he fortunately responded to me and said, hey, you screwed this up. You got to do it this way. And as soon as I did it the right way, everything worked out, fortunately. So that's what I'm just sitting here going, crap. Either I got the wrong rings or I'm doing something wrong. And it turns out, yeah, I was 100% doing something wrong. So once I get that figured out, I'm going to go through, I'm going to start putting rings on. And then I realized that using the rod vise is going to stabilize the piston, so I don't even have to hold it while I'm putting these rings on. Oh, it made everything so much easier. I wish I was smarter the first time, or like on the first piston, thought, oh, just put it in the vise, it'll be better. But anyways, I eventually get smart, use the rod vise, and get all the rings on all the pistons. I don't think there's too much more to talk about. Just follow the manufacturer's instructions, which is what I'm doing. Double check your work is super important. On piston 1, actually, I got ring number 2 upside down. So as I'm going through verifying, I'm like, where's it supposed to say top? It doesn't say top, and then it's on the bottom. So I had it upside down. So yeah, just verify what you're doing. Because obviously right here, I'm putting this on upside down. Or it might have been that I needed to deburr it, so I pulled it back out and I didn't check it when I put it back in. So in any case, just double check your work, take your time. There's no need to rush this, especially if it's the first time you're doing it.
now that we have all of the rings on the pistons correctly, we can start installing the rods and the pistons. So I have a tool, it's in my hands right now, that is a piston ring compressor. Effectively, what it does is it's got a bit of a bigger opening at the top and it tapers down. So what happens is you slide the rod in from the bottom of the rod into the top of the tool, and then you guide the piston down through it. And as the piston goes more in the tool, all of the rings get smaller and compress, because when the ring is in the bore, it's compressed. When it's, just out and free, it's actually quite a bit larger. So as you can see here, I've got the tool, it's just sitting on the deck. What I'll end up doing is putting a piston in, pushing it down. I'll take a special hammer, I'll beat the piston down, and you got to be pretty careful with this tool because it doesn't really sit in the bore at all, it just sits on top. So what'll happen is if you're not holding the tool down firmly, which I wasn't on some of these, so I had to redo them, but the ring will pop out the bottom of the tool and expand, and then that's no good. So you got to pull the piston back out, and restart the whole process. So I did run into some challenges where, as I'm tapping the piston down, the bearing, came off of the rod. That happened not a ton, but a few times. It was quite frustrating. I mean, obviously, I eventually get all the rods and the pistons in, but it's just something to be careful of, as you're tapping this down. If you're needing to tap it fairly hard, the bearing might pop out of the rod. So just one of those things to keep in mind and, be careful of. I guess the battery died before we got 4 installed, but it's all installed, so let's just crank it all over and see how it all goes. Man, that is a beautiful sight. That red block, those beautiful diamond pistons going up and down. Yeah, I'm pretty jazzed about that. So next up, I need to install the oil galley plugs. So when they cast these blocks, in order to get oil from the front of the engine where the oil filter is to the back of the engine, they actually have long rods that drill from the front all the way through the back. So in order to seal those up, they supply these little plugs. So you got to put the plugs in, and I was like, oh crap, I already got the camshaft retaining plate on, and it was pretty tight, but luckily the the plug just luckily squeezed by with just enough clearance. So when I get the engine off the stand, there are 3 plugs I believe I need to put in the back of the engine still. So what happens is if you don't put those plugs in, It's just a big open hole, and you're going to have massive oil leaks. And if you have that at the back of your engine, that's going to be a real bad day. It's going to cover your flywheel. It's going to cover your clutch. Front of the engine bleeding off. Like you'll effectively have like zero oil pressure because it's just a big, massive, gaping hole in the front of the engine. So that's not great. Now I got those plugs installed. I am moving on to installing the timing set. So this is a Rollmaster timing set. It's got, I think it's, you can do plus 4 degrees, minus 4 degrees on the cam. So it's got an adjustable crank gear so you can advance or retard the timing as needed. And we will be doing the camshaft to figure out exactly where the cam is. Now, when you buy a camshaft from a manufacturer, they will usually send what's called a cam card. The cam card is going to have critical information about what your camshaft does, what the intake center line is, where all of the events are supposed to happen. So like when is your intake supposed to start opening? When does it close? When does your exhaust start opening? When does it close? How much overlap is there? How much lobe separation is there? All that good stuff. If I didn't have an adjustable timing set, I would simply be verifying my cam timing. And in my case, my cam timing would have been 2 degrees advanced, which not the end of the world. Because, I'm actually going to tune the car and make sure that the timing is good. But if it's 2 degrees advanced and, we think we want, say, 34 degrees, well, we might only need to put 32 in because the camshaft itself is already advanced. So, that being said, I'm just going to go and start measuring. After I figure out how to get the crankshaft gear on, because it is super tight. So is the cam gear. Alrighty. So I measured, and the cam gear is like 1/1000 smaller than the snout of the crank, which is pretty much nothing. So what I found is I can just take a dead blow hammer and I can just tap it on, and actually it goes on super easy. And then I just switch over to using a brass punch. Brass is a super soft metal, so if you're hitting it up against something that's steel, chances are the brass is going to move long before the steel does. So you don't want to damage these pieces. So yeah, using a soft metal like brass is the way to go. So as you can see, I'm just tapping it on. I'm trying to get the camshaft going kind of at the same time. But I'm having a hard time getting the camshaft or getting the timing set on the camshaft. And not only that, the camshaft, it can slide back in the tunnel. And if it slides back too far, it actually falls out the back bearing. So I don't want it to do that since it's already been retained. So I'm trying to be careful. I've got just a cam bolt in there. I'm trying to, use it and pull it through, but it's not really working. So it's just, I'm having a bit of a tough time. So what I'm eventually going to end up doing is, and also I can't get the crank gear off anymore. It's kind of stuck on there. I don't really have a good angle to get it off. And yeah, the cam bolt is just not long enough to draw the timing set in. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to head over to the hardware store, and I'm just going to get a like a 2-inch or 2.5-inch long bolt. And what I can then do is with some washers, I can work the cam gear in as I tap the crank gear in. So that way they both go on together. Otherwise, the chain would be really pulled, and that's not good for it. So I'm going to struggle with this a little bit more before I go out and I get a longer bolt and, just kind of pull it on.
All right, now I have the tools that I need. So I've got a 3-jaw puller, so I'll be able to get this crank gear off. And then as I said, I bought a bolt, so I'll use the bolt and I will draw the timing set on. When I do this initially, I'm going to set the dot on the timing gear to the dot on the cam gear. That's just a neutral timing. So yeah, let's get this crank gear off and then we'll get the whole timing set on. So now that I got the timing set on, I'm just flipping or rolling the motor over, and I'm just taking a quick peek, make sure that the pistons are all going to clear the camshaft. There's no interference, and yeah, I mean, I kind of figured everything was going to be good, but just, never hurts to double check. So now that I have the timing set on, I'm going to... Am I going to put the main timing bolt on? I think I am. And that'll kind of draw it on more. But as you will see here pretty quickly, there's a little dowel pin on the front of the camshaft, and that is to drive a mechanical fuel pump eccentric. Now, I don't have a mechanical fuel pump. I'm not putting that eccentric on. So because of that, the dowel pin is actually going to pull out the front of the timing set. So I'm going to have to modify a washer in order to fit over the dowel. But I just put a little assembly lube on the chain. I just want to, make sure as I'm rolling this over, it's got a little bit of oil on it. And I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to check top dead center just to, give myself a little bit of peace of mind. Yeah, so I'm throwing the cam bolt in there and I realize that there's that dowel pin. So I actually have to go off on a bit of a tangent and, as I say, modify the washer.
yeah, so with that washer modified, cam bolt goes in there. I can spin everything over, just making sure everything spins over nicely still. Just torquing up the cam bolts. And then we are going to start degreeing the camshaft. So I kind of touched on this a little bit before, but degreeing the camshaft, just make sure that the valve events happen when you want them to. So make sure it just makes sure that the intake valve starts opening at the correct degrees, and if not, you're going to adjust it. So as I said, mine was 2 degrees advanced. So through my camshaft or my adjustable crankshaft sprocket, I was able to retard the camshaft 2 degrees and get it onto the proper 110 degree center line. Would those 2 degrees have made a massive difference? Probably not, but I'm, spending a ton of money on this build. I might as well do it as properly as I can. So yeah, I'm not going to go through the degreeing process in this video. There are a lot of people out there who explain degreeing a camshaft. I'm not great. I am this engine builder, but I am not an engine builder. So I'm not going to go through it. But long story short, I'm going to find true top dead center, and then I'm going to advance the crankshaft 50,000 degrees past max lift on the intake valve, or intake lobe, I should say, and then I will go back to 50,000s before. I mark the degrees at both those spots, add them together, divided by 2, and that tells me what the center line is. I ended up being 108, so that means that the intake is firing at 108 degrees, which is 2 degrees advanced. It should be firing at the intake is opening at 108, I should say, not firing, but the intake is opening at 108, should be opening at 110, so it was 2 degrees advanced, meaning it was opening sooner than it was supposed to. So yeah, I adjust the timing, I retarded at 2 degrees, and I hit that 110 center line. Now that I have absolutely nailed the camshaft centerline and degreeing this cam, it is time to do a little bit of cleanup because it's a bit of a mess in the shop. Alrighty, now that the bottom end is done, it is time to start working on the top end. So in that box are two beautiful AFR 220 heads for my small block Ford. Those are part number 1456, I believe. Just absolutely beautiful pieces. I'm so happy with those things. Should make some decent power. Like it's a 2.1 inch intake valve. I don't remember what the exhaust is. 220 cc per head. Up to 710 lift is what the springs are good for. Yeah. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to clean them up a little bit, and then we are going to start putting one of the heads on the engine. So I need to do a couple of things with the heads before I can, fully put the top end together. So what I'm doing here is that is a valve spring compressor. I'm compressing the valve spring, and I'm going to remove the valve spring off of the, that's going to end up being the number 4 intake and exhaust. For some reason I thought I was doing number 1. Oh, that's because, did I put the head on 5, 6, 7, 8? That's why. Okay, that's 1, 2, 3, 4. I put the head on 5, 6, 7, 8. But if that was 1 and flipped around, okay, that makes sense. So anyways, I'm taking the valve springs off of the first 2 valves. So that's the front, which is an intake, and then the second, which is an exhaust. And I'm going to put just some really lightweight springs in. So they're called checker springs. So these springs here, I could not open that valve by hand. I mean, maybe with all of my weight and all of my force, I could move it a tiny little bit. But these other springs that I'm putting on, you can kind of see I can just push it down with my hand and it just goes right on. So the reason why I need the checker springs is I need to check my valve spring I need to check for how long of a push rod I need. And so in order to do that, I need to be able to put the rockers on. I need to have a little valve or push rod length checker tool. I need to put that in there, and that little push rod length checker tool is just like the cheapest aluminum you could ever find. And if I had those big heavy springs on there, it would just destroy it. So I need to put these small little checker springs on there so that I don't destroy the tool that's going to allow me to measure for push rod length. So in order to do that, I need to put a head on. So I need to get head studs on one half of the engine, then put the head on, torque the head down, get one rocker set in there, and then I can check the push rod length. All right, folks, since we now have that absolutely gorgeous AFR head torqued down to 110 foot-pounds of torque, that is all the time that we have for this week. So as always, if you stuck around this long, I'd like to thank you for viewing, and we'll see you in the next one.